Detroit, Michigan, July 18, 1969. Captain Nguyễn Văn Tài stood motionless on the observation deck of the Ford River Rouge complex, his hands clasped behind his back, in the position he'd maintained through 3 years of captivity. Below him, a B-52 bomber took shape every 8 hours on an assembly line that stretched beyond his field of vision. Metal screamed against metal. Sparks showered from welding torches. The air tasted of motor oil and possibility. He'd shot down 2 American helicopters near Khe Sanh before his MiG-17 fell from the sky in January 1966. He'd endured interrogations, solitary confinement, and the peculiar American obsession with making him comfortable. But nothing. Not the daily rice rations better than what his unit received in the field. Not the medical care that saved his infected leg, not even the color television in the camp recreation room, had prepared him for this. A foreman shouted something in English. The assembly line lurched forward. Another bomber, another instrument of destruction that would drop its payload on his homeland, rolled toward completion. Captain Tài did the mathematics in his head. 8 hours per aircraft, 3 shifts per day. This single factory produced more heavy bombers in a month than North Vietnam's entire Air Force possessed. The American escort officer, a Marine major named Henderson, who'd lost his own son over Haiphong, stood beside him. Impressive, isn't it? Captain Tài said nothing. What could he say? That he'd spent the morning calculating how many of his countrymen would die beneath wings forged in this temple of American abundance? That he'd realized, standing here amid the clangor of unfettered industrial capacity, that every tactical victory, every downed aircraft, every American body shipped home in a flag-draped coffin meant precisely nothing in the algebra of this war. He'd believed they were winning. Now he knew they were merely not losing quickly enough to satisfy American voters. There was a difference, a profound difference, and it changed everything. The program began in April 1967. A Pentagon initiative born from frustration and an almost touching faith in the power of facts. Operation Revelation, the classified documents called it. The premise seemed straightforward. If captured North Vietnamese officers could witness American industrial and agricultural capacity firsthand, they might grasp the futility of their cause and either defect or, upon eventual release, spread demoralization through Hanoi's command structure. "We're not trying to break them," explained Colonel Richard Stratton of the Defense Intelligence Agency in a memo to Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara. "We're trying to enlighten them, show them what they're really fighting against. Not American soldiers, American productivity." The logic reflected a peculiarly American assumption, that seeing would lead to believing, that empirical evidence would trump ideology, that rational actors presented with overwhelming proof of their strategic disadvantage would naturally seek accommodation. It was the same thinking that had led McNamara to believe that precisely calibrated bombing campaigns would bring Hanoi to the negotiating table, that body count ratios could measure progress in a revolutionary war, that superior technology and resources guaranteed victory. The first group of 15 NVA officers left Travis Air Force Base on April 23, 1967. They'd been selected carefully. Field-grade officers, decorated combat veterans, men with engineering or technical backgrounds who could appreciate what they were about to see. Most had been captured in 1965 or 1966. Most had refused all previous cooperation with American interrogators. None had seen their families since deployment. Major James Carpenter, the program's architect, believed the tours would be transformative. "These are educated men," he told his staff. "Engineers, teachers, former university students. Once they see the scale of American production, the automobile factories, the steel mills, the wheat fields of Kansas, they'll understand the mathematical impossibility of their position. What Major Carpenter didn't understand was that for North Vietnamese officers, mathematics had never been the point. The initial itinerary read like a propaganda officer's fever dream. Detroit's automobile plants, Pittsburgh's steel foundries, Boeing's Seattle facility, Iowa's mechanized farms, and Houston's petrochemical refineries. The prisoners would see America's economic engine not as captured enemies, but as reluctant students of industrial reality. The expectation was simple. Overwhelming evidence would produce predictable results. Vietnamese officers would return to Hanoi, either through prisoner exchanges or, as the war wound down, general releases, carrying stories of American abundance that would undermine revolutionary fervor. They'd tell their comrades that the United States could produce more in a month than North Vietnam could manufacture in a decade. Morale would crack. The will to resist would crumble. It was good theory, American theory, and like so much American theory applied to Vietnam, it fundamentally misunderstood who they were fighting and why. Lieutenant Colonel Pham Tuan, a SAM site commander captured after the Christmas bombings of 1966, later recalled his initial reaction to the proposal. "I thought it was a psychological operation, another form of torture. Show us everything we can never have. Break our spirits through comparison. I went expecting propaganda. What I saw was something more dangerous. Truth." The first factory visit occurred on April 27, 1967, at a General Motors assembly plant in Flint, Michigan. 15 Vietnamese officers, wearing ill-fitting civilian clothes provided by their captors, walked through a facility that produced 1,200 automobiles daily. The plant manager, a Second World War veteran named Robert Hayes, had been briefed to answer all questions honestly and comprehensively. "I showed them everything," Hayes recalled in a 1985 interview. "The assembly line, the parts warehouses, the quality control stations. One of them, a major I think, asked me how many workers we employed. I said 4,800 on 3 shifts. He got very quiet. Later, through the interpreter, he asked how many cars we'd built since the plant opened in 1953. I didn't know the exact number, but I estimated around 3 million. He did some calculation in his head, and then he laughed. Not a happy laugh, a bitter one." That major was Ngo Van Chieu, an artillery officer from Hanoi, who'd been educated at Soviet technical schools. He'd calculated that the Flint plant alone had produced more vehicles in 13 years than all of North Vietnam's industrial capacity. Every factory, every workshop, every cottage industry could produce in a century. The laugh was recognition of scale, recognition of the enormous asymmetry between what his nation possessed and what it opposed. But Ngo didn't despair, and that's what the Americans never understood. "Yes, they can build more," he said to his fellow prisoners that evening, back in their quarters. "They can build more cars, more planes, more bombs, more everything. But they cannot build more will. And in the end, that's the only factory that matters." The factory tour program emerged from the Pentagon's broader struggle with Vietnam's asymmetric nature. By late 1966, American forces had won every major engagement, killed Vietnamese fighters at ratios exceeding 10-1, and dropped more ordnance on North Vietnam than had fallen on Europe during all of World War II. Yet Hanoi's forces grew stronger, recruitment increased, and the flow of men and supplies down the Ho Chi Minh Trail accelerated. Defense analysts called it the paradox of dominance. Overwhelming superiority in every measurable category producing no corresponding strategic advantage. McNamara's systems analysis approach, which had revolutionized Ford Motor Company and promised to bring scientific management to warfare, couldn't explain why superior inputs weren't generating superior outcomes. The idea for factory tours originated with Dr. Herman Kahn, a Rand Corporation analyst whose 1965 study industrial demonstration as psychological warfare, proposed that North Vietnamese prisoners represented an underutilized information vector. If these officers could witness American productivity firsthand, Kahn argued, they'd become inadvertent agents of demoralization upon repatriation. The Geneva Conventions prohibited coercing prisoners, but nothing prevented voluntary educational programs. The military's Judge Advocate General's office spent months crafting the legal framework. Prisoners would be offered, never ordered, the opportunity to visit American facilities. Participation would not affect their prisoner status or treatment. They could decline without consequence. Everything would be documented for potential post-war review. Major General Horace Moore, who commanded the Military Assistance Command's Psychological Operations Division, championed the program despite skepticism from field commanders. "We've tried bombing them to the table," Moore argued in a January 1967 briefing. "We've tried killing them faster than they can recruit. We've tried burning their jungles and poisoning their crops. Maybe it's time we tried showing them reality." The program required coordination across multiple agencies. The Defense Intelligence Agency selected prisoners based on rank, combat record, and estimated influence within North Vietnamese military circles. The State Department coordinated with governors and mayors in host states, framing the visits as opportunities to demonstrate American openness. The CIA provided security assessments and monitored prisoners for intelligence-gathering attempts. Training the escorts proved challenging. They needed to be combat veterans. Prisoners wouldn't respect anyone else, but also patient guides capable of explaining complex industrial processes through interpreters. Most importantly, they needed to resist the urge to gloat. "You're not there to rub their noses in it," Major Carpenter instructed his team. "You're there to educate them. Let the facts speak for themselves." The first interpreters were Vietnamese Americans who'd fled south after the 1954 partition. Their presence created its own tensions. Many prisoners viewed them as traitors, complicating communication. By mid-1967, the program had recruited ethnic Chinese from Hong Kong and Singapore, neutral third parties who could translate without the political baggage. Early tours focused on heavy industry, steel production, automobile manufacturing, aircraft construction. The thinking was straightforward. Show them the tools of American military power being forged in quantities beyond Vietnamese comprehension. A typical tour lasted 10 days, visiting 4 or 5 facilities across 2 or 3 states. Prisoners traveled in small groups, never more than 5 at a time, accompanied by 2 military escorts and an interpreter. Security remained paramount. POWs wore civilian clothes to avoid drawing attention. They stayed on military bases when possible, secure motels when necessary. The American public, deeply divided over the war, never learned about Vietnamese prisoners touring factories, while American soldiers died in rice paddies. The program remained classified until 1985. By December 1967, 37 North Vietnamese officers had participated in factory tours. Their reactions troubled program administrators. Rather than expressing despair at the asymmetry, prisoners showed professional curiosity mixed with a kind of grim determination. They asked detailed questions about production schedules, supply chains, and quality control. They took notes when permitted, memorized when not. They were studying their enemy, learning his strengths, and, crucially, his vulnerabilities. Captain Nguyễn Văn Tài, an engineering officer captured near the DMZ in October 1966, spent 3 days at a Boeing facility in Seattle. He asked the plant manager how many B-52s the factory could produce if it ran at maximum capacity 7 days a week with unlimited resources. "Maybe 30 per month," the manager answered. "But we'd never do that. Workers need rest. Quality would suffer. Costs would become unsustainable." Huang nodded thoughtfully. Through his interpreter, he asked one more question. And what would it take to make you stop producing them at all? The manager, a practical man who'd built bombers through Korea, smiled. I suppose if Americans decided they didn't want them anymore. If the political will disappeared. Exactly, Huang said. Exactly that. Ford River Rouge Complex, Dearborn, Michigan, July 19, 1969. The realization didn't arrive as sudden epiphany, but as gradual accumulation, like water filling a depression in rock. Captain Nguyễn Văn Tài understood it fully on his second day at River Rouge, watching the steel rolling mill transform molten ore into structural components with the mechanical indifference of tide-wearing shore. The complex employed 100,000 workers across 2,000 acres. It consumed ore from 7 countries, rubber from 5 continents, and enough electricity to power a city of 500,000. It produced not just automobiles, but the complete supply chain, from iron ore to finished vehicle, under a single administrative umbrella. Its daily output exceeded North Vietnam's entire annual industrial production. How much does the average American worker earn here? Tài asked his escort through the interpreter. Major Henderson consulted with the plant's human resources director. About $10,000 annually, maybe $12,000 with overtime. Tài did the conversion in his head. The average American factory worker earned more in a single year than a North Vietnamese general made in a decade. Not slightly more, exponentially more. This wasn't industrial capacity. It was a different civilization, an alternate reality where abundance rather than scarcity shaped possibility. But it wasn't the wealth that troubled him. It was the fragility. What happens if there's a strike? He asked. Production stops, Henderson answered simply. Happened in '67. Shut down everything for 67 days. And the government? Stayed out of it. Company and unions negotiated. Tài nodded slowly. In North Vietnam, strategic industries never stopped. Workers couldn't strike. The government didn't negotiate with production facilities, it commanded them. American abundance came at the price of American freedom, and American freedom created pressure points that no B-52 could bomb, no Marine battalion could assault, no naval blockade could close. Later that day, the group visited the adjacent Ford stamping plant, where machines pressed flat steel into body panels. The noise was overwhelming, a physical force that compressed thought into pure sensation. One machine malfunctioned, creating a small delay. Workers immediately clustered around it, consulting technical manuals, debating repairs. No one looked frightened. No one scrambled to fix it before superiors arrived. The foreman joined the discussion as a participant, not as an authority figure demanding results. Major Nguyễn Văn Tài, a logistics officer who'd spent 2 years managing supply routes along the trail, watched the scene with professional interest. How long until it's fixed? He asked. Hour, maybe 2, Henderson said. They're good at what they do. And if they weren't? If they were slower, less skilled? Henderson shrugged. We'd train them better, hire more workers. It's just a machine. We have others. Just a machine, Jiang repeated. He turned to Captain Tài and spoke rapidly in Vietnamese, forgetting for a moment that everything was being recorded and translated. They have so many machines that a broken one means nothing. We have so few machines that a broken one means everything. But they depend on machines. We depend on people. Machines can be replaced, but they break. And the system that makes them breaks too when people refuse to make them. The observation proved prescient. By 1969, anti-war sentiment had penetrated even America's industrial heartland. Some workers at River Rouge wore peace symbols on their hard hats. Others displayed photographs of sons serving in Vietnam, not with pride, but with anguish. The plant's chaplain conducted weekly services that increasingly focused on moral questions about weapons manufacturing. The next turning point occurred at a Dow chemical facility in Midland, Michigan on July 23, 1969. The company produced napalm among its many products, a fact that had made it the target of ongoing protests. Campus demonstrations, stockholder revolts, and recruitment boycotts had troubled Dow's executives, though production continued without interruption. Lieutenant Colonel Lê Minh Hugh, an air defense commander who'd shot down 4 American aircraft before his capture, watched the chemical processes with cold professional attention. Then he asked a question that stopped his escorts short. "How many protesters were arrested outside your gates this week?" The plant manager, clearly uncomfortable, consulted with corporate security. 17. They're usually released without charges. Usually. We don't like prosecuting them. Bad publicity. First Amendment issues. They're mostly college kids. Hugh smiled for the first time since his capture 18 months earlier. In my country, protesters would be shot. In your country, you negotiate with them. This is why we will win. Not because we're stronger, because you're weaker in the ways that matter. That's not weakness, Henderson shot back, his face reddening. That's freedom. It's what we're fighting to protect. Yes, Hugh agreed. And it's also what will make you stop fighting. Freedom means choice, and Americans are choosing to stop this war. The prisoners returned to their holding facility at Fort Sheridan, Illinois, that evening in thoughtful silence. Over dinner, pork chops, green beans, fresh bread, and ice cream, a meal of staggering abundance by their standards. They discussed what they'd witnessed. The conversation, recorded by intelligence officers, revealed a fundamental shift in their understanding. Captain Tai spoke first. "We cannot outproduce them. We cannot outkill them. We cannot match their technology or their wealth. We always knew this. What we didn't know is that we don't have to." "They're fighting an optional war," Major Jiang added. "We're fighting an existential one. They can choose to stop. We cannot. That difference is our asymmetric advantage." Colonel Hugh pushed his plate away, the food mostly uneaten despite its quality. "I've been thinking about the protesters outside the chemical plant. They weren't attacking the factory. They were attacking the war. They weren't demanding the government seize the means of production. They were demanding it stop using that production for purposes they found immoral. This is something we could never do in Hanoi. But it's also something the Americans cannot prevent without becoming what they say they're fighting against." The recordings reached MACV headquarters in Saigon within 48 hours. Analysts noted that rather than demoralizing the prisoners, the factory tours had clarified their strategic thinking. The program continued, but internal assessments grew increasingly pessimistic about its effectiveness. By mid-1970, the factory tour program had evolved in response to prisoner reactions and changing war conditions. Where early tours focused on overwhelming visitors with sheer industrial scale, later iterations attempted to demonstrate American benevolence, agricultural productivity that could feed the world, medical facilities that could cure diseases, educational institutions that could train generations. The shift reflected growing American unease about the war's direction and purpose. If raw industrial might couldn't convince North Vietnamese officers that resistance was futile, perhaps demonstrating that America fought from humanitarian motives rather than imperial ones might bridge the understanding gap. Lieutenant Colonel Tran Van Hung toured a John Deere facility in Moline, Illinois, in August 1970. He watched combine harvesters the size of small houses roll off assembly lines, machines that could harvest more grain in a day than 1,000 Vietnamese farmers with hand tools could gather in a season. The implications staggered him, not because America could feed itself, but because it chose to let others starve while spending billions on bombs. "Why not send us these machines instead of bombers?" he asked his escort, a colonel named Davis, who'd completed 2 tours in Vietnam and returned home to anti-war protests. Davis had no good answer. The question wasn't really about agricultural policy. It was about the fundamental incoherence of American strategy, capable of spectacular material generosity while simultaneously prosecuting a war of immense destructiveness, unable to choose between liberation and domination, between assistance and assault. The prisoners adapted their approach to these tours as well. Initial groups had maintained hostile silence or offered minimal responses. By 1970, POWs engaged actively with their hosts, asked detailed questions, and pressed Americans on contradictions within their own system. They'd realized that these tours weren't just opportunities to see American capacity, but also to understand American psychology. Captain Nguyễn Văn Tài, an intelligence officer captured in Quang Tri Province in March 1969, toured a General Electric plant in Schenectady, New York in October 1970. The facility produced jet engines for F-4 Phantoms, among other products. Sun asked the workers questions that unsettled his military escorts. Did they know what happened to the engines they built? Had they seen footage of Vietnamese villages bombed by aircraft using their work? How did they reconcile their daily labor with its ultimate application? Most workers admitted they tried not to think about it. Some expressed regret. A few defended their work as supporting American troops, even if they opposed the war. Others said they needed the paycheck and couldn't afford moral luxury. One electrician, a Marine Corps veteran of Khe Sanh, broke down crying while explaining that working on aircraft engines felt like the only way he could still help his buddies who remained in country. The complexity troubled Sun more than the machinery. This wasn't an evil empire producing weapons of oppression through coerced labor. These were ordinary people, often conflicted, working within a system they didn't fully control or comprehend, producing instruments of destruction as casually as they might manufacture refrigerators or washing machines. The banality of it, the moral diffusion across so many hands that no single person felt responsible, proved more disturbing than deliberate cruelty. Back in his quarters, Sun wrote in his concealed diary, discovered after his 1973 release, "I understand now why they cannot win. Not because they lack capacity. They have capacity beyond imagination. But because they lack conviction that matches their capability. A society that questions itself cannot sustain indefinite war against a society that does not." Meanwhile, American perspectives were shifting in ways the program's architects hadn't anticipated. Escorts who began the tours convinced of American righteousness found their certainty eroding. How could you explain to a Vietnamese prisoner that Agent Orange was a necessary military tool when you couldn't explain it to your own children? How could you justify the destruction when prisoners asked reasonable questions you couldn't answer? Major Henderson, the Marine escort who'd begun the program as a convinced hawk, requested transfer after his 8th tour in November 1970. "I can't keep doing this," he told his commanding officer. "These aren't ignorant fanatics. They're educated officers fighting for their country. When I look at them, I see my son. When I look at our factories, I see the machinery of slaughter. I don't know who's right anymore." The program also revealed fractures within American industry. Workers at some facilities refused to participate in prisoner tours, viewing them as propaganda exercises. Management at several defense contractors declined to host POWs, fearing it would energize anti-war activists. Union leaders split over whether factory tours helped or hurt the war effort. By 1971, with American combat forces drawing down and peace negotiations advancing in Paris, the factory tour program entered its final phase. Fewer prisoners participated. Most would be released soon anyway. and those who did tour facilities were shown agricultural and medical capacity rather than military production. The emphasis shifted from demonstration of might to promises of post-war reconstruction. It was too late. The prisoners had already learned what they needed to know. Not that America was powerful, they'd always known that. But that American power, for all its enormity, depended on structures more fragile than they'd imagined, an industrial base that could be disrupted by strikes, a political system that bent to public pressure, a society that questioned its own purposes, a military that fought without the total commitment that Revolutionary War demanded. The factory tour program reached its maximum scope in 1970, when 63 North Vietnamese prisoners participated in tours across 17 states. Intelligence analysts compiled hundreds of hours of recorded conversations, thousands of pages of reports, and detailed assessments of prisoner reactions. The data was overwhelming. The conclusions were devastating. Program effectiveness, measured by the Pentagon's original objectives, approached zero. Not a single prisoner defected after touring American facilities. Not a single participant expressed willingness to encourage Hanoi to accept American peace terms. Post-tour interviews revealed that prisoners understood American industrial capacity more completely than before, and remained more committed to continuing the fight, not less. Major General Thomas Caldwell, who'd replaced Moore as MACV's psychological operations commander, summarized the program's failure in a classified December 1970 memo. "We have successfully demonstrated to captured enemy officers that the United States possesses industrial capacity, technological sophistication, and material wealth beyond their comprehension. This demonstration has not produced the anticipated demoralization. Instead, it has clarified for the enemy exactly what they're fighting against. Not military strength, but systemic vulnerabilities inherent in advanced industrial democracies waging optional wars." The final assessment cut deeper. We showed them our factories. They saw our doubts. Yet, in one respect, the program succeeded beyond anyone's expectation. It provided an unintentional mirror, forcing Americans to see their war through Vietnamese eyes. The questions prisoners asked, simple, direct, sometimes devastating in their naivete, exposed contradictions that American strategic thinking had papered over. When Captain Vu Jin Thong toured a Boeing facility and asked why America built bombers instead of schools, the question seemed simplistic, but it crystallized the resource allocation paradox. A nation wealthy enough to simultaneously fund Great Society programs and Vietnam escalation, choosing to do both poorly rather than one well. When Colonel Phung Van Not watched combines harvest wheat in Iowa and asked why Vietnam received bombs instead of tractors, the question seemed propagandistic. But it highlighted the contradiction between stated American objectives, helping Vietnam develop, and actual American actions. Devastating Vietnamese infrastructure. When Lieutenant Le Quang Tho toured a Chrysler plant and asked how many cars Americans needed when much of the world walked barefoot, the question seemed ideological. But it forced engagement with the moral economics of abundance. Whether material prosperity justified its defense through violence in distant lands. The prisoner's most persistent question proved unanswerable. If you can build all this, why can't you win our small war? Americans offered various responses. Constrained rules of engagement, political interference, terrain challenges, external support from China and the Soviet Union. But the prisoners recognized these as excuses rather than explanations. The truth they understood, and Americans struggled to acknowledge, was that industrial capacity couldn't substitute for political will, that superior productivity couldn't overcome motivated resistance, that an optional war would always lose to an existential one in any contest of endurance. By late 1971, With American ground forces largely withdrawn and peace negotiations advancing, the factory tour program wound down. The final tour occurred in February 1972, just weeks before the Easter offensive demonstrated that North Vietnamese forces remained formidable despite years of attrition. Major Nguyen Van Trong, captured in 1968 and held for 4 years, participated in that final tour. He visited an IBM facility in upstate New York where computers, room-sized machines of staggering complexity, processed data with speed beyond human comprehension. The guide explained that these computers helped plan American military operations, optimizing logistics and targeting with scientific precision. But can they calculate will? Trong asked. Can they measure determination? Can they process the variable of one side willing to fight for generations while the other wants to stop tomorrow? The guide admitted that no. Computers couldn't calculate intangibles like national resolve. Then they cannot help you win, Trong said simply, because that's the only calculation that matters. The factory tour program ended officially in March 1972, though its final assessment wasn't completed until 1974, after the Paris Peace Accords and the return of all American POWs. The classified review concluded that the program had failed its primary objective, demonstrating to North Vietnamese prisoners the futility of opposing American industrial power, while succeeding at an unintended one, revealing to American planners the limitations of that power. Captain Nguyễn Văn Tài, the MiG pilot who toured River Rouge in 1969, returned to Vietnam in March 1973 as part of the prisoner exchange. He resumed his military career, eventually rising to general officer rank in the reunified Vietnam. In a 1995 interview with a Vietnamese military magazine, he reflected on his time in America. I saw factories that could produce a year's worth of North Vietnamese industrial output in a single day. I saw wealth that made our poverty look absolute. I saw technology that seemed like magic. And I understood, finally, why we would win. Not because we were stronger, we weren't, but because we had to win, and they only wanted to. The program's failure illustrated a persistent American blind spot. The belief that material demonstrations could overcome ideological commitment, that showing people their strategic disadvantage would make them accept it. This assumption underpinned not just the factory tours, but America's entire Vietnam strategy. The idea that sufficient force, properly applied, would produce inevitable results. North Vietnamese officers who participated in the tours didn't return home demoralized. They returned home educated. They understood American strength more completely, which helped them identify American weaknesses more precisely. They'd seen industrial capacity that couldn't be disrupted by military action, but they'd also seen a political system that could be influenced by public opinion, a society torn by moral doubt, and an economy dependent on workers who could choose to strike. The factory tours taught them that America's center of gravity wasn't in Vietnam. It was in Detroit, in New York, on college campuses, in living rooms where families watched Walter Cronkite deliver casualty figures. You couldn't bomb that center of gravity. You couldn't assault it with infantry. You could only endure long enough for Americans to decide the war wasn't worth its costs. For American participants, the program proved equally educational. Major Henderson, the Marine escort who'd lost his son over Haiphong, retired from service in 1971. He became an anti-war activist, not from ideological conversion, but from accumulated encounters with prisoners whose motivations he couldn't dismiss as fanaticism or ignorance. I showed them our factories, Henderson said in a 1983 oral history. I showed them our wealth, our technology, our capacity to produce anything in any quantity. I thought I was showing them why resistance was pointless. What I actually showed them was why their resistance mattered. Because all that capacity, all that wealth, all that technology, it couldn't create the one thing they had, and we didn't, absolute certainty about why we were fighting. The program's legacy extended beyond Vietnam. In subsequent conflicts, the Gulf War, Somalia, Iraq, Afghanistan, American military planners rediscovered variations of the same lesson: that industrial superiority couldn't guarantee strategic success, that destroying enemy capacity didn't necessarily break enemy will, that winning battles wasn't the same as winning wars. The factory tours represented a microcosm of American Vietnam strategy, a well-intentioned program based on sound theoretical assumptions that foundered on the reality that people fighting for their homes operate from different calculations than people fighting for policy. You could show North Vietnamese prisoners 1,000 factories, 10,000 factories, factories stretching to every horizon, and still not convince them to stop fighting, because the factories, for all their abundance, couldn't produce the one thing that would have mattered: a reason for them to quit that outweighed their reason to continue. In the end, the program's greatest success wasn't what it taught North Vietnamese prisoners about American industrial might. It was what it taught Americans about the limits of that might. Power, they learned, isn't measured only in what you can build, but in why you're building it. And a nation that can't answer that question clearly, that questions itself even as it fights, that values freedom enough to let its citizens dissent from its wars. Such a nation possesses strengths that factories can't forge. But it also possesses vulnerabilities that no amount of industrial capacity can armor against. Captain Tai understood this, standing on that observation deck in Dearborn in July 1969, watching bombers take shape with mechanical inevitability. The factories would keep running. The bombs would keep falling. The war would continue. But it would end, not when America's factories stopped producing weapons, but when America's people stopped accepting the reasons for using them. That was a calculation no computer could make. And that was why, despite seeing everything America could build, he knew they would prevail.